for us, and here we go. So, back in July, August, when I was trying to put together the calendar for Christian education for the year, I looked ahead, and as I always do, and make a full year, and realized that it's the year of a presidential inauguration, that there was going to be politics involved this winter, and especially this January. In the past, when we've had major things like that in January, I've had sermon series and other things. But I thought, what better thing for us to do than to sort of talk about church and society, different aspects of faith life in the public sphere, you could say. Faith in the public square, some people call it. And what better way to talk about it? You know, it's something that arguably Lutherans and many mainline Protestant denominations were kind of really good at for a while, sort of through the civil rights movement, and then didn't so much follow after that. We did. I mean, we the ELCA has an office of advocacy at many state levels and certainly at the federal level, but sort of at the same public persona of faith that, say, the evangelicals have, or that some other faith organizations have. Many mainline Protestants and certainly the Lutherans don't have quite that face, and part of that is that we don't always understand the relationship of church and society. And I'm going to throw it out there, particularly more progressive, left-leaning denominations often sort of don't want to toe that line and sort of be respectful in the public sphere. And so what better way for us to sort of dig into this than to have some conversations around it here. I really want it to be conversations. I'm going to throw out, you know, as always, I have enough stuff for us to fill our time, but certainly I want to be sure that if there are things people want to bring up, by all means, please unmute yourself and say so. But, you know, the sort of outline for the sessions is in the e-news. You've seen that. But this week, we're starting with sort of the so-called separation of church and state. I half put it in quotes there. Separation of church and state, because I think this is really the crux of faith lived publicly in the United States that I think we often don't fully understand. And so I want us to sort of be able to unpack it a little bit. So, there we go. So we're going to start with the First Amendment. First Amendment, the United States Constitution, the first right in the Bill of Rights, is by now a relatively famous one for both good and ill. It is relatively famous, but I want us to sort of focus in on this because this is really where things get started in the United States. So the First Amendment to the Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right to people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. But I want us to focus on those first two, right? So the first right given to citizens in the United States by the Bill of Rights is that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what's interesting is we often think of this as religious freedom, right? That's how it's been billed now. Christian liberty, religious liberty, freedom of religion, because we have to somehow put it in this list, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition. So we're going to call this freedom of religion. But the interesting thing is that's not actually what's there. Now, there is freedom of religious exercise there, but it actually falls into two parts, known as the two clauses. So there's the Establishment Clause, which is the first part, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and the Exercise Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And what we'll see is those sort of get pieced apart a little bit, but we recognize two different aspects of this sort of freedom of religion that that the United States is not a theocracy, right? So the Establishment Clause is that the United States is not a theocracy. We do not have a national church. We do not have a national faith. We do not actually have a faith identity at all, right? The idea that the United States is a Christian nation isn't actually borne out by history or any texts that we have. So the United States not being a theocracy means that Congress or any part of government, state or federal, cannot establish a national religion or denomination or prayer time. Religion cannot be sanctioned, encouraged. We'll talk more about this as we go on. By the government, right? Taxpayer dollars cannot go to religion, basically. There's some caveats to that, but for the most part, sort of that's generally what we're talking about here. A sort of secondary meaning of this Establishment Clause, as it's known, is that Congress or any part of government, state or federal, cannot show preferential treatment, positive or negative, to anyone on religious grounds, right? So you can't have preferential treatment for Christianity over Judaism or over atheism itself, right? You can't show this preferential treatment, which really is borne out in several Supreme Court cases about whether or not they're sort of a state church, right, at the state level, whether or not they're sort of a denomination that gets to pray more often in the legislature or anything else like that. But that's what we're talking about with establishment. Nobody can even infer that there's a preference for one religion, faith, denomination over any other. And then the exercise clause, which sort of teased out is that Congress can't stop anyone from worshiping in the way that their religion dictates and can't restrict the actions of someone based on religious grounds. So like there can't be laws, for example, that all people have to eat pork, or that pork can't be like the only option offered in public schools, because obviously there are religious dietary laws in several religions against pork. And so you have to be able to have options or just skip the pork altogether, right? It's sort of a very simplified version of this. Some of the, but it's a little more focused than I think some people think. Right, this isn't, well, we'll get to the next slide and then we'll come back to this. So what does it, so that's what it means, right? The First Amendment means that there will not be an establishment of a religion and there will not be a prohibition against religious participation by people. What does it not mean? What it does not mean is that one's religious practices, beliefs, restrictions, or otherwise can be enforced on others, right? So that this is about not allowing one person to impose their beliefs on another. That is not restricting the free practice thereof, right? So when we talk about the exercise of religion, telling someone that when your religion tells you to, in the most extreme version, right? There's a religion that talks about if there were, right? So sort of the idea of, well, now I'm drawing blanks, but you generally get the idea on this one, right? Is that this is the idea of my practice for myself, for my family even, right? For minor children and dependents. Our religion can dictate our actions, but sort of when it bleeds over to other people or an expectation that other people follow along or make acquiescence thereof, it doesn't go that far, right? Because that's the thing for us to remember, is that this is about government restricting the free exercise. This is not saying every private business, right? This isn't saying, oh, Chestnut Hill Coffee Shop can't say, well, nobody can pray here, right? That's not a restriction of exercise by the government. That is a private business saying we don't want religion on our grounds, right? And so that's perhaps an example there. It also doesn't mean that religious institutions are exempt from all laws and rules, right? This isn't saying like, oh, we, just churches get to sort of float out there on their own. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of ways that religion and government have a very cautious relationship, shall we say. Um, but it doesn't mean that there isn't the need for religious institutions to follow the rules and regulations of our society. So for example, in recent months, religious institutions have tried to maintain their worship life by citing the First Amendment, right? Saying, oh, the shutting down of all businesses is infringing on our free exercise of religion. Well, yes, except all businesses, all religions, all faiths, all people are being shut down for public safety. So that so long as these religious institutions are not unduly targeted because they're religious institutions, they can still be restricted for the purposes of public safety. Meaning, so for example, if the rule of law was, well, there's no restrictions on any other business, right? So we will let the gym stay open, we will let the schools stay open, we will let the bars stay open, but we're going to shut down just the churches, just the Christian churches. That is an infringement on the free exercise of religion, because what you're saying is churches can't do something. But saying that all businesses, all places where people congregate have to follow the same rules, not that. The thing is, it's sticky, right? It's a very tenuous relationship that church and government have together. So challenges are there, and do they have grounds? Well, some of them have yet to be seen, but that's sort of where, modern day, present day issues where we get into this. It also doesn't mean that an individual can have free reign and claim religious exemption. So it's a fine line, and many won't go anywhere near it, but usually religious practices has to be sort of relatively commonly held and needs to, as we talked about a little bit before, needs to not sort of bleed into other people's rights. So for example, something about this is, what's her face from Kentucky, the clerk of county in one of the counties in Kentucky, that when marriage equality came through, refused, in her role as a government official, paid by federal dollars, or well, by state dollars, but paid by the government, paid by tax dollars, refused to sign marriage licenses for non-heterosexual couples and cited religious liberty, right? It's against my religion to allow two people of the same gender to get married, so I won't do it. That's not really how it works, because your job says you gotta. And that's not infringing on her religious liberty, because, and part of this goes back to the individual, right? If you know that's a problem with your religion, then that's not the job for you, right? I mean, so again, it's this weird fine line that is very murky. I'm by no means putting myself out there as sort of the expert in any of this, but sort of how does this work in the world? How is this playing out, sort of for our sake of our conversation? So it's sort of these weird fuzzy lines, but that's when we talk about exercise, that's where those lines are. So I'm going to pause here for a minute. We've done the First Amendment and what does it mean and what does it not mean. Questions on sort of the exercise and the establishment and the exercise clauses, First Amendment and stuff like that. Yes, Larry.
I heard you say, if I heard you correctly, the job requires it.
In that one example I was using about what's her name? Yes. So in that case, because the job she had required it, but she knew her own position, right? The job she had was asking her to do something. Having requirements for employment is absolutely something. They didn't say, hey, only the Christians have to sign marriage licenses, or
Yeah.
only, right, or only the Christians can't, right? That's where you'd get into this. But the fact that there is a requirement from the federal level to the state level of all clerks of county must sign marriage licenses for all the couples that come to them, that's just a requirement of the job. And so it
Yeah.
wasn't, so it all goes to this idea of, is it specifically targeted based on a specific religion or a specific faith or a specific denomination? Otherwise, if it's just sort of a general rule and you don't like it, well, then find a different job, right? Go, and that's where that fine line is. And
It
again,
reminded me of pharmacists that won't fill prescriptions for certain medications that they feel don't respect their religious beliefs.
Well, I mean, and it's the same thing for, and I'm not going to lie, because it keeps getting challenged because, frankly, it's wrong. But it's the idea under the Affordable Care Act that institutions like Hobby Lobby, which is not a religious organization, it is a private business, but a business nonetheless, not a religious institution, won't pay for a lot of health services such as birth control and otherwise, because it's against their strongly held religious convictions, right? But they're not a religious institution, and so so I will say some of that is what is found and what should be, in my opinion, are two different things. But again, there's these fine lines of who gets to claim this versus others, right? Certainly, we found that organizations run by the Catholic Church, right? Catholic parochial schools, Catholic charities, Catholic hospitals. There's a lot of things that they're exempted from because they're run by the Catholic Church. They are religious institutions. That's something. Hobby Lobby, that's something different. And I'll be honest, I don't remember how Hobby Lobby was found, but it's very interesting how this plays out. Bex.
I had a comment, which is that I think the fine line, as you aptly called it, between what I think of as the legitimate government authority to pass laws for the common good on the one hand, and freedom of the exercise of religion on the other, I think that line is really, really interesting and really important to approach and touch and examine, because harm can be done in the name of religion, and
Yes.
is done. For example, there are religious extremists who beat and even torture their children in the name of religion, but happily, the laws of the land make it illegal for them to do that. So I think, well,
keep going.
It ends up being examined by the courts, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, and I think it's really interesting because one can imagine that these standards of public good that are reflected in our laws might actually evolve over time and change from generation to generation, and it's important for that relationship between religious institutions and individuals versus the government, that be worked out in a dynamic and vigorous way from generation to generation.
Which is an interesting point you bring up, because certainly we know, and has come up a lot in the last few months, there are sort of two different ways of reading law, right? There is the originalist who says, if it's not there, it's not there. And the other one that says, yeah, but if it's not there, that doesn't mean it's not there. That just means they didn't write it down, right?
Well,
It's
hopefully,
interesting.
yeah, hopefully
I
we
want to
might
say,
have a balance of different legal theories.
sure. Well, and so I was going to say the interesting thing, the parallel that I make is there's the same thing that people talk about when it comes to scripture, particularly in Christianity, right?
Yep.
The idea of whether you are a biblical literalist or a little bit more of an abstract thinker. Lutherans tend towards the more abstract thinking. Not to say that there aren't some things, I mean, we recognize that there's sort of a lot of, it's very, uh, it is very, very subjective. What I would say to you, Tom, and the reason why I hesitated there for you on that one part wasn't that you're wrong, you're right. But again, you touch on another one where we get into this religious exemption, religious whatever, that has come up relatively recently with our sister state, New Jersey, just across the Delaware, that just in the last 2 months passed laws prohibiting conversion therapy. So again, talking about the allowance of people to abuse their children on the basis of religion, conversion therapy is one that really disguises itself, right? So for those that don't know, conversion therapy is the idea that you can, through physical or spiritual means, stop someone from being non-heterosexual and non-cisgendered, right? So that gay youth and trans youth and anything else, right, that's not cisgendered heterosexual, can sort of be prayed away or can be conditioned away. And that there's this gray area of whether or not that's allowed. And from those who have been through it, if you listen to their stories, if you've heard their stories, it is abusive, right? It is the idea of literal electricity being used on people to condition them to feel otherwise. It's sort of this weird, wonky area. Like, is it okay to electrocute a child for their feelings? No, maybe, but is it okay to sit them in a room without food and water, surrounded by a bunch of strangers, praying for 12 to 18 hours a day without letting them sleep or eat or drink or go to the bathroom? Well, if your religion says so, maybe, right? And so it gets to be these really
And there's
fine
nothing wrong with your
lines.
religion.
Okay.
Well, I mean, fair enough. I agree,
Right.
obviously. But what I would say is, those places that until it's challenged, as you're saying, Tom, until it's challenged, until those conversations are had, until those lines are towed, there's a lot of people sort of are allowed to get away with, shall we say, in the name of sort of this religious freedom.
Right.
So I thank you for bringing that up. And that's the only reason why I hesitated on are there these limits on people being allowed to actually physically abuse their children based on this? No. At the same time, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists are allowed to deny their children vaccines, blood transfusions, and other medical interventions based on religion.
Right.
Right? I mean, so is that abuse? No. Is that exercise of religion? Technically, is there a fine line there? Yes. And that's why this is so interesting. And what I would argue, and one of the things that I should have said earlier on, one of the reasons why I want us to have these conversations is it is this sort of blurry line, and it is fascinating conversations to have. And the problem is we all, in various ways, have been too reluctant
Yep.
to actually have the conversations.
Yep.
And the problem is then people are allowed to maintain positions for themselves, to not challenge it, to not challenge themselves, to not challenge others. And what we've done is we've lost the ability to have the conversation about them. And I would argue that's politics, that's religion, that's sex, that's science. Like we've just lost that ability because we've never really wanted to challenge each other. And we're seeing it in our own ELCA, right? The idea of bound conscience is that we have the difficult conversations and can agree after the hard conversations to disagree. That's bound conscience. But most of the church, and especially bishops, take bound conscience to mean you don't have to have the conversation. That's not true, right? You have to have the conversation. And I think that's especially true when we talk about these sorts of things.
I-
And so that's partly why I want us to do this, because I think if we don't even have the conversations, we are that much less likely to engage our faith in the public sphere. And arguably right now, shall I call us the more progressive side of Christianity is desperately needed to be heard in the world. So yes, Tom.
Now, I'll try to keep it quick because I don't want to monopolize, but I love the direction you're going in. I think not only what I was saying earlier was that it's important for, part of what I was saying was that it's important for the government to maintain public safety by challenging religious practices that are harmful, and that needs to be hammered out.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is especially within religious practices of people who call themselves Christians, I think it is important for us to challenge each other so that harmful practices don't become normal.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't expect that all of the responsibility cannot be on the government to check the errors of religious people. But maybe by having symposia like this one, we can encourage each other in our thinking to follow Christ closely.
Exactly. So I'm going to bump us up to sort of a slightly different part of this conversation, which is the separation of church and state, which is often what we think is established in the First Amendment. It is not. The separation of church and state is a phrase that's very common. We often, as I said, we often think that it's sort of what is enshrined in the First Amendment, but it's often misunderstood. First of all, it's not found anywhere in our government documents. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. It's not anywhere there. It's not actually a legally binding idea until it is used in Supreme Court findings based on a personal letter of Thomas Jefferson. So that the first time that we see separation of church and state as a phrase, Thomas Jefferson is writing a letter to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, who were seeking advice from Thomas Jefferson because the Congregationalists in Danbury, Connecticut, who had the majority of citizens in the city, were claiming that because of that, because the majority of citizens were Congregationalist and not Baptist, that the Congregationalists, by right of being Congregationalists, could establish Congregationalism as sort of this sort of preferred religion, to which Thomas Jefferson very rightly shuts them down. But that's the first time that we get this phrase of separation of church and state. That's not to say it doesn't otherwise get used. It does get used, but it's not actually in legal findings until 1878. So we're talking, what, a full 102 years after the Declaration of Independence, little less than 100 years after the Constitution itself, when the Supreme Court in, let me look it up. I don't have it here, but it's the first, 1878 is the first time that the Supreme Court uses the phrase, the wall of separation, implying the separation of church and state, in one of their findings. So when we talk about the fact that this is very much misunderstood, it's very much misunderstood in that we seem to think this is what's established by the First Amendment, but it's not, right? At no point does the Constitution say people of faith can't speak from their faith perspective in the common square. At no point does the Constitution even say that someone can't mention their faith, talk about their faith at a government meeting, right? None of that's actually in there. But that's what we think of, because I would argue, now I'm adding some opinion to this, because I would argue it's a lot easier and a lot more comfortable for us to just say, well, we don't talk about these things. The problem is, when we don't, somebody does, right? And so we need to be able to have these engaging conversations. And again, this goes back to what we were just talking about on the last slide. So this is the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Danbury Baptists. Gentlemen, because they were, the affectionate sentiments of esteem and approbation which you are so good as to express towards me, on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association, give me the highest satisfaction. My duties dictate a faithful and zealous pursuit of the interests of my constituents, and in proportion as they are persuaded of my fidelity to those duties, the discharge of them becomes more and more pleasing. So they wrote to him. He was president. They needed help. He actually wrote back. And hey, it's great that you have one of the original authors of like the Declaration of Independence as president still alive, so we can have some explanation. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, sorry, Jefferson writes in the 1800s, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Good on him for quoting the Constitution. He is the president called to defend it, and he's doing that. Thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender you for yourselves and your religious association assurances of my high respect and esteem. Basically saying, you're right. On the other hand, is this squabble between two religious factions something the state should get involved in? Maybe not. But this is the letter, January 1st, 1802, that is the first time we see this phrase, the wall of separation between church and state. Which is to say, in Jefferson's opinion, what is put forward in the First Amendment is that when it comes to these sort of interreligious squabblings or conversation, right, the state can't step in and can't decide those. At the same time, the church can't get in the way, according to this, with what's happening on the state side. Meaning, for Jefferson, no, the Congregationalists can't say that Congregationalists get a majority because they're Congregationalist, because now that's the church interfering with the state, right? And so it's sort of so this begins that sort of very at times tense standing of who gets to actually influence one another. Right. And that's what's going on here when it talks about church and state. It's who has influence, who has the ability to make the rules. And the general idea is the church, right? People of faith make rules about faith, and the state makes rules about the common life. And that's how that works, right? And that is what this means. This isn't saying that people can't pray on a street corner, right? This isn't saying that there can't be prayer at public meetings. It's saying that there can't be a preference, right? And so we'll get to some of those things as we move on. So that's what we're talking about with church and state. This is the origin in this letter from Thomas Jefferson of this specific phrase. James Madison, sort of a colleague and peer of Jefferson, shares his shares the sentiment of Jefferson on the separation, but he actually points to Martin Luther as the basis for the separation in the Doctrine of the Two Kingdoms. So for those who don't know, the Doctrine of the Two Kingdoms states that the law, capital L, God's law, has two functions, two ways that God works in the world. One is temporal, physical, and human governing, actual government, and the other is sort of the eternal, spiritual, salvific, churchy, faithy one. and that the law, the grand scheme, major law of the world is set forth by God, works in both ways. Both are necessary, both are ordained by God, but the church deals with one and government deals with the other. Now, I would argue that Madison gets this 75% right, maybe even 80% right. He's on the right track with the idea of two kingdoms. Luther also didn't really have a conception of leaders that weren't Christian. So it doesn't quite extend that far. And so when we get into sort of really the United States experiment of true religious pluralism, I'm not sure Luther could have conceived of that. But still, this idea that, you know, both of these things are good and they're separate, but they're right, I think he was onto something. And certainly for us Lutherans, that's a good little tip of the hat to us. So before we move on to this one, I want to stop with church and state. So separation of church and state as a thing. Questions, comments, concerns?
Was James Madison a pious individual?
The early, many of, I don't know who has what as far as their actual faith on record. What I will say is most of the founding parents were deists. The idea, you know, God the divine clockmaker, deists, the idea that there is a God, there is the divine providence, right? The only mention even tangentially of God in the Declaration of Independence is divine providence of a creator. And that's like as specific as they get. And so was he a church-going Christian? Most of them weren't. Did he and Jefferson both go to religious services in the Capitol building? Yes. Was it probably Anglican Episcopalian? Yeah. Is Anglican Episcopalianism still kind of the de facto in the United States? Kinda. That's where it gets really wonky. But the fact of the matter is, what were they exactly? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Wikipedia is great with that kind of stuff. I encourage Wikipedia for quick facts like that.
Sorry about such an open-ended question.
No, it's fine.
Hey, Pastor?
Yes.
A quick look at Wikipedia reveals that Madison was of all things a Presbyterian. Whether or not that makes him pious, I don't know. But he was tutored by John Witherspoon, the Great Awakening, who was president of the New Seminary.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Thank you.
He was a religious person of sorts.
Good.
Another question.
Yes.
So in America, our separation of church and state that was so little publicized, is that, would I think of that sort of coming from the English tradition? Because I know that, just speaking as someone who loves organ music, many European countries support their churches financially and have great organs, but in England, the organs have all rotted, I understand. So do we get them from the Brits, that separation?
Say that again about organs in the, say that again about how organs fit into this.
It's my understanding that English churches have not had financial support from the government in contrast to mainland European, continental European churches. So the organs have suffered.
I mean, in different ways, yes. I mean, but certainly we know that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is the state church. The Queen is head and monarch of the Church of England. But yes, I mean, in the way that like Germany, Sweden, right, part of your tax dollars go to pay for the local pastor. Both Lutheran states, by the way. But so you have those. Definitely this idea of the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment itself, the freedoms given in it, are absolutely reactionary to what's happening in Great Britain at the time. Additionally, though, we see that the First Amendment grows out of many religious tolerance laws and regulations within the colonies at the time. So we know, for those of us that have grown up in Pennsylvania, we know that Penn's Woods was founded with this idea of religious tolerance. Was it as tolerant as they say it was? I think we're finding different stories now, but definitely this idea that there was no sort of official religion here. Same thing in Maryland. The big deal in Maryland was that Catholics even could worship freely, which is as opposed to, say, Massachusetts, where into the 1800s, Puritanism was the religion, right? Puritanism growing into Congregationalism was the state religion in Massachusetts until the 1830s. And so we see that there was some difference there. Now, what's curious about that, as we pull that up, is this idea that it's not until it's challenged in the 1830s that the federal government steps in and says, oh, that freedom of religion thing, yeah, that counts at the state level too. Because again, elsewhere there's conversations about the relationship between states and federal government. But yes, are these ideas, are these separations reactionary to Great Britain? Absolutely. That's kind of the whole story of like the first 50 years of the United States. So yes. Yeah.
Thank you. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One quick question, Pastor.
Yes.
Did Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms deal with the line, whether a crisp line or a fuzzy line? I wonder what he thought of it, between things temporal and things eternal. Was it clear to him?
Well, I mean, and I'll add temporal and eternal, just two things I had to come up with a way to describe it quickly on a slide. But sort of this idea of the two kingdoms, which is what Luther actually calls it, but the two hands of God, the two swords, right, are the two ways that the law is in effect in the world. Meaning, and I don't
a strict, a bright distinction.
In the way that separation of church and state means, no. In the way that people should recognize that there are places and ways in which the government works that may or may not be at odds with Christianity, but should be allowed to because they themselves are God ordained, yes. Does he? I would argue perhaps the best place to read about this would be like in his writings on the Peasants Revolt, for one. And then there's another one, To the Christian Princes, that he writes, which by its title obviously tells you he can't conceive of government that's not Christian. But does he deal with it quite like this? Not really, but that wasn't his point. I'll have to look into that a little bit more. I'll make a note here. If you don't hear back from me in a little bit, let me remind me. But I feel like there's some places where he writes on these sorts of things. But I mean, certainly depending on how you read it, when Luther writes about the plague of what, 1532? I don't know. He writes about how he will refrain from certain religious activity because because that's what the sort of outlying regulations are. Let me look into that a little bit more, Tom, because that's a good perspective that I hadn't really thought about in presenting this. Let me look into that. So is it applicable? Is the separation of church and state, as we think of it, is it applicable legally? Well, it depends who you talk to. And it's how it gets applied, that's a bigger question, I think. The thing is, it doesn't mean that religious services or actions or sentiments can't be performed or enacted in the government or on government property, right? Children can still read the Bible and can still pray, for example, in public schools. Clergy can even come in to speak for like career day, right? But such actions can't be mandated and cannot put the children performing such actions at either an advantage or disadvantage. So for example, children can't be forced to take time out of class to pray, but they can't be granted special dispensation to do so either. So that's why a lot of things like Bible reading, praying are done at lunchtime, at recess, in study groups, during study periods. It's why there was a big deal for a while when I was in school of schools that like 10 minutes before the opening bell of school would be like the prayer circle around the flagpole, right? That's fine. But that's not what separation of church and state is talking about. It's not saying that you can't do that. Separation of church and state is saying, but the church can't say, hey, we don't agree with that, so it shouldn't be a law. Well, too bad. The government makes the laws, the church deals with other stuff, right? And that's if we were to apply it, that's what we're talking about. So what we get to, as we continue having these conversations, are two tests. The lemon test is the first one. I'm not going to lie, I don't remember the whole story about what was going on and what the argument was that hit the Supreme Court in 1971. But the case was Lemon versus Kurtzman. You can feel free to go look it up. Again, Wikipedia is a great place. They have all the findings and stuff on this stuff. But you also can just type in lemon test and you'll get a lot of information on this. But the lemon test means that in the finding of Lemon versus Kurtzman, the majority opinion from the Supreme Court said that there were three requirements to test whether this was a challenge to the First Amendment and whether it was legal or not. I believe this might have been whether or not a nativity scene could be displayed on public property. I know that was an early one, but figure it's something like that, right? Can we or can't we? The three questions are, or what is that, and these are called prongs, right? So we had clauses, now we have prongs. There's all sorts of fun language we have about this. But so the purpose prong, the first prong of the Lemon test, says that the statute, the rule, the law, the action by a government has to have a secular purpose. There has to be something secular about it because otherwise it's a religious act. The effect prong says that the principal or primary effect of the statute or action or law must neither advance nor inhibit religion. So for example, if you were to put up this nativity scene on, so like in the state of Connecticut, every town has a green, has the town green in the middle of town, often still owned by the Congregational Church in town, by the way, but sort of as the public meeting space is what it was, but every town has a green. And most of them around Christmas time put up a nativity scene. It's considered public property. And so we for purposes of this, we will say it's public property. Putting up a nativity scene isn't proselytization, right? It doesn't say, ooh, as soon as you look at a nativity scene at Christmas time, you're going to become a Christian. Most people understand Christmas with some Christian roots, right? Nativity scenes are part of decorations. It also doesn't stop Jewish people or Muslim people or Hindu people from worshiping by having to walk past a nativity scene. So we're good to go. The third prong is the entanglement prong and asks that the statute must not result in excessive government entanglement with religion. This one gets a little wonky. No one's really quite sure what this means, but it's there, right? It's the entanglement prong. So this was 1971. Along comes our first female justice of the Supreme Court, Senator O'Connor, who clarifies the entanglement prong in 1984. So it took 13 years for people to kind of clarify a little bit better. And what she comes along with is the question of endorsement, that really what needs to be asked about a rule, an action, a statute, whatever, an allowance by the government. But what needs to be asked about anything where government is involved or touched by or touches religion is endorsement. Meaning, and she writes, this is her finding, by the way, this is a concurring opinion, she agreed with the finding. The Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion, prohibits the government from making adherence to a religion relevant in any way to a person standing in the political community, right? So what your religion is does not define your citizenship. Government can run afoul of that prohibition by endorsement or disapproval of religion. Endorsement sends a message to non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community, and an accompanying message to adherents that they are insiders, favored members of the political community. The proper inquiry under the purpose prong of Lemon is whether the government intends to convey a message of endorsement or disapproval of religion. Meaning, if the local council of churches pays for, maintains, cleans, sets up, tears down the nativity scene and asks for it to be put on the green in Connecticut, is there sort of this favoritism being shown, right? Are we endorsing it? Well, the government's not paying for it. The government's not having any part in putting it up. But is there a potential that someone who's not Christian will say, well, why can't I put up mine? This is what comes up when we have a lot of conversations around, where was it, in Florida somewhere, where the potentially the Church of Satan wanted to put up a aluminum pole in the state capitol next to the Christmas tree that was put up as part of their religious celebration. And the question came in was whether or not putting up a Christmas tree in like the state capitol building was this endorsement of a Christian celebration. Christmas, I will say, continues to be that weird, wonky, we don't know what to do with it. Largely, the government stays out of religious festivals and feasts and holidays. But Christmas is the weird one where like schools are still closed for it and government still shuts down for it, but it's really a religious holiday. And they don't do that for, say, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. The schools may, depending where you are in the country, schools may, some government offices may, but not in the same way, right? Hanukkah is not in the same way, Passover not in the same way as like Christmas. At the same time, I think a lot of arguments have been made about whether or not Christmas in the secular realm is endorsement of a religious festival, and I think that arguments have been made there. So that's sort of a very interesting, I think, thing. But again, this idea of endorsement added to the Lemon test is what is asked by governments, the Supreme Court, other courts, when it comes to these sort of religious liberty things, right? Is telling you that you as a county clerk must marry all couples that come to you and are of legal age, of consent, otherwise unmarried, etc. Is that prohibiting you from exercising your religion? No. Is it infringing on your religion? No. Is it favoring one over the other? No. It's saying that these are the requirements of the job. So Justice O'Connor later explained in her concurring opinion later in 95 that this endorsement test focuses on the perception of a reasonable, informed observer. Such an observer must be assumed to be aware of the history and context underlying a challenged program or religious display. Meaning, is the person walking past the nativity scene even going to care? Are they going to know that this is part of the celebrations of the season, right? And it's still very wonky. It's still a very fuzzy line. So what does it all mean? It means that there's nothing, legally speaking, to prohibit religious folks, that's you and me, from being active and public in our displays of religion and from participating as people of faith in the common civic life. Meaning, can we go into the school board meeting and say, from my perspective as a Christian, this is why we should care for our children in XYZ way? No, bring it on. Can you walking in and saying my religious faith says that we should do XYZ for children at the school board meeting and have it therefore apply because you say so? No. Right? And this is where we get into those ideas of Congress still opens with a prayer. There is still a chaplain to Congress. As a matter of fact, a woman was just named by Speaker Pelosi. Why? We started getting into questions of how is that allowed? Well, that's allowed because not having a chaplain stops people from being able to participate in religion. It's the same question of how does the government get away with paying military chaplains? So how do we pay clergy with taxpayer dollars? Because if there's not a chaplain and you're in the middle of the desert in Afghanistan somewhere, how you praying? Right? I mean, now, yes, we would argue that people can pray on their own and those sorts of things, but you are denying people access to a clergy person. And so, because that's getting in the way of free exercise, then we pay for them. So it's all these fuzzy areas. Yes, Larry.
The smaller bullet point there, I'm sorry, the second bullet point. Could you just explain that? Such participation, however, I don't
right.
quite get.
So that's what I was saying, is that you and I, there is nothing that says you and I can't step out in public in the civic world and speak as people of faith, right? My faith tells me that we should give to things like taxes because it works for the common good, and I am called to love my neighbor. And to stand up at the city council meeting and say that, totally allowable. However, that you said that really has no bearing on whether or not it's enacted in the civic realm, right? You're stepping in and saying, well, my faith perspective says that I shouldn't have to pay taxes because it's pennies from heaven to me, so I shouldn't have to give it up. Too bad. That's the rules of the society we live in, right? And so that's what I mean there, is that I can speak, I can act, I can live in the world as a person of faith and as publicly as I can, but that actually doesn't influence anybody else at the civic level. That's all that means. So that's the end of our week this week, and it is exactly 8 o'clock. Look at that. We'll continue on as we go with this and sort of tease out other aspects of living in sort of the civic sphere, living in the public sphere, teasing out more of those things of what do we actually do with it, right? So leaving us here is this idea that you and I can, and Lutherans would say we are called to, live in the world as people of faith, that our faith should inform the ways that we participate in our society. So we're going to leave it here and look at some of the ways that we do that as we move on. I want to take some time this week to establish that that's even possible when we seem to have these sort of wonky feelings on it in the 21st century. But before I go, are there last questions, comments, concerns before we hit next week?
Loved it. Very interesting, especially
Yeah,
the mention of some dates on Judea O'Connor, and I guess a lot of this was first brought out in the courts with Lemon in the 1960s and 70s. I guess
so much is done. So much we have this from the courts. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, Tom or Elizabeth, whoever's calling from that number.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
fabulous.
I think this is great and needed.
It is funny how things all play out this way.
Yep.
Totally planned before this. Yes,
Right.
John.
I think we're in a period right now where the court is making a little bit of a shift because of the new appointees.
Yeah.
So
It'll,
that's the curious thing. Is it or isn't it? Interestingly enough, nothing that has come up since the court has been full again has really had a litmus test on their standings on sort of religious liberty in this sort of way. There's been a couple that have been heard, but of course it's the Supreme Court. They don't have to give their findings until the end of the year. So, but you know, I want us to allow ourselves to be surprised at the same time by some folks who have been recently appointed, especially given the fact that the Supreme Court has treated the recent election like a hot potato, which no one expected, right? People had expectations around that. And so I want us to sort of be mindful of the fact that because there is such wide variation on how people interpret the First Amendment and other precedent, I want us to allow ourselves to be surprised. I'm with you, John. I'm expecting the worst, but
yeah, we've already been
surprised.
We've already been surprised by some of the decisions, you know, that have come down, especially like the one about the Civil Rights Act. You know, affirming the meaning of sex in the you know, discrimination by sex and whatever the others are.
Exactly.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, thank you all, and we will see you next week.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Or
Thank you.
we'll see you, or